Welcome to Reveal Fears. Subscribe and like this video.
Part 1. Arrival at Greylock Station. The sky was the color of tarnished steel when I stepped off the bus. Greylock Station. Even the name seemed wrong somehow, like a place that had been misplaced on a map but stubbornly stayed where it wasn't supposed to be. The driver tossed my duffel bag into the dust, gave me a look that might have been pity, and slammed the door. I was alone. Greylock wasn't on any of the tourist maps I'd consulted. No advertisements. No cheery slogans to draw in visitors. Just a vague mention in an old travel guide, a place described as remote and a relic of the industrial age. That suited me fine. I'd wanted solitude, a break, a chance to think. Ahead of me was the station building, squat and unwelcoming, its paint peeling like dead skin. Beyond it, a town shrouded in mist, barely visible under the oppressive gray sky. The silence was absolute. No chirping birds, no rustling leaves, just the faint hum of electricity from a sagging power line overhead. The door to the station hung ajar, creaking faintly in the slight breeze. I hesitated. Something about the emptiness felt wrong. The kind of wrong you don't notice until your instincts scream at you to turn back. But I wasn't here for comfort. The interior was dim, lit by a single flickering bulb that barely pushed back the shadows. The air smelled of mildew and something faintly metallic. There was no ticket counter, no signs, no indication this was a functioning station. Just an old wooden bench and a set of stairs leading down. I didn't see the man at first. He was sitting in the far corner, his outline almost blending with the shadows. When he spoke, his voice was low and rasping, like a dying breath. "You shouldn't have come here." I froze, my heart thudding in my chest. "What?" He didn't respond, just stared at me with sunken eyes that gleamed faintly in the dim light. Then, as if summoned by my arrival, the faintest sound reached my ears, a distant, rhythmic thumping. From below, the man stood slowly, his movements stiff and mechanical. He pointed to the stairs. "They always come at night. You'll see." "What comes at night?" I asked, but he was already walking past me, his footsteps leaving faint imprints of dampness on the dusty floor. When I turned back, he was gone, and the rhythmic sound had grown louder. Part 2. The stairwell. I don't know why I didn't leave. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, grab my duffel, and catch the next bus out of Greylock. But something rooted me there, curiosity, maybe, or pride. I told myself it was the same stubbornness that had brought me here in the first place. The rhythmic thumping was louder now. It came from the stairwell ahead, its metal banister rusted and streaked with dark stains that looked too organic to be rust. The bulb above me flickered again, and for a brief moment, the entire room plunged into darkness. When the light came back, something had changed. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. The air felt heavier, charged. The faint metallic tang in the air grew sharper, like blood or hot iron. The walls, scabbed with peeling paint, seemed closer than before. My pulse quickened. The sound continued. Thump, thump, thump. Slow, deliberate. The stairs were steep, descending into a black pit. I hesitated at the top, peering down into the void. The light didn't reach far. Shadows pooled at the edges, thick and impenetrable, shifting slightly as if alive. Against my better judgment, I stepped forward. Each creak of the wooden steps echoed like a scream. My hand grazed the banister, and I pulled it back immediately. It was sticky, the texture clinging to my skin like sap. Or something worse. About halfway down, the smell hit me. It wasn't just the mildew or the metallic tang anymore. This was something rank, decayed. My stomach churned as I fought the urge to gag. The air grew colder, too, each step dragging me deeper into a chill that settled into my bones. The thumping grew louder, more erratic, as though aware of my approach. Thump, 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 thump. "Hello!" My voice was barely a whisper, swallowed by the oppressive air. No response, only the sound, now so loud it vibrated in my chest. At the bottom of the stairs, the darkness pressed against me like a living thing. My fingers fumbled for a light switch on the damp, crumbling wall, but I found none. And then I saw it. A door stood at the end of a narrow corridor, barely visible in the faint light spilling down the stairwell. It was heavy, industrial, and pockmarked with rust. The thumping came from behind it, each blow rattling the frame. I froze. The rhythmic pounding wasn't random anymore. It was deliberate, almost purposeful. And with every thump, I could swear I heard another sound beneath it. Something faint, wet, like nails scraping across flesh. My breath hitched. I don't remember deciding to move, but I was suddenly there, standing inches from the door. The air reeked now, and the metallic tang had grown sharp enough to sting the back of my throat. I raised my hand, trembling, and placed my palm against the cold metal surface. Thump! The door jolted under my touch. Part 3. Behind the door. I staggered back, my pulse hammering in my ears. Whatever was behind that door, whatever was making that sound, it wasn't something I wanted to meet, but I couldn't leave. The thumping had changed. It wasn't just pounding anymore. There was a scraping sound now, uneven and clawing, like something dragging itself across the floor. The noise sent a shiver crawling down my spine, but I leaned in again, closer this time. Thump! SSKKKRR. Who's there? My voice cracked, too weak to carry. The only response was another scrape, louder this time. I looked back toward the stairs. The faint light from the bulb above barely reached the landing. Beyond it, there was nothing but shadow. Somehow, it felt even darker now, as though the light itself was losing the will to fight back. Then the door creaked, just slightly. Not enough to open, but enough to let something slip through, the unmistakable sound of breathing. It was ragged and uneven, each exhale wet and bubbling. My stomach clenched at the sound, and before I could think better of it, my hand was on the latch. Don't! The voice came from behind me, sharp and commanding. I spun around so quickly I almost lost my footing. The man from upstairs was back. He stood halfway down the stairwell, his figure half swallowed by the gloom. His face was shadowed, but I could see the gleam of his eyes, locked on me with an intensity that made me step back. "Don't open that door," he said again. His voice was low, almost a growl. I swallowed hard. "What's in there?" "You don't want to know." I glanced back at the door. The pounding had stopped, replaced by that horrible wet breathing. It sounded closer now, like the thing behind the door was pressed against it, waiting. The man took a step forward. His movements were stiff, almost unnatural, like his joints were rusted. "Listen to me. If you open that door, you won't come back up." His words hung in the air, heavy with finality. "What is this place?" I asked, my voice shaking. His lips twisted into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Greylock isn't a place. It's a mistake. A wound that never healed." I didn't understand, and I didn't have time to ask. The door rattled violently, the sound echoing down the corridor like a gunshot. Both of us froze. My heart felt like it might burst out of my chest as I watched the door frame shake under the force of something slamming into it from the other side. And then it stopped. Silence. "Step away," the man said. But I didn't. I couldn't. Something held me there, some unseen pull that rooted me in place. My hand hovered over the latch again, trembling. "Don't," he said, his voice rising in urgency. But I was already turning the handle. Part 4. What came through? The latch turned with an audible click, and the door inched open, groaning like a dying thing. Behind me, the man cursed under his breath, his footsteps pounding down the stairwell. "Stop! Close it now!" But it was too late. The first thing I noticed was the smell. It hit me like a fist, a rancid cocktail of rotting meat, scorched metal, and something sour like vinegar left out in the sun. I gagged, my knees nearly buckling. Then came the cold. Not the kind that chills you on the surface, but the deep, biting cold that seeps into your bones and makes them ache. My breath came out in short, foggy bursts as the temperature plummeted, the sweat on my skin turning clammy. I peered through the gap, and my heart nearly stopped. The corridor beyond wasn't like the one I was standing in. It was wrong. The walls were the same grimy concrete, but they shimmered faintly, like oil slicks caught in the light. The floor was covered in something dark and viscous, a thick sludge that shifted as if alive. Shapes moved in the shadows, too large, too many limbs, and the air was filled with faint whispers, overlapping in a language I couldn't understand. But the thing at the center of it all, the thing that had been pounding on the door, it crouched low, its massive body half hidden in the murk. Pale, glistening flesh stretched too tight over a skeletal frame. Long arms, jointed in too many places, ended in claws that scraped at the floor. Its head tilted toward me, eyeless but aware. Its mouth, if that gaping, wet cavity could be called a mouth, twitched, revealing rows of jagged teeth. And it was smiling. Behind me, the man grabbed my shoulder, yanking me back so hard I slammed into the wall. The door swung open wider, and the creature shifted, its body folding unnaturally as it began to rise. "Why did you do that?" the man hissed. His voice shook with something close to panic. "Do you have any idea what you've just—" The creature took a step forward. The sludge beneath its feet bubbled and hissed, sending up tendrils of steam. Its long, spindly arms reached out, clawing at the air as though tasting it. The whispers grew louder, sharper, like thousands of voices rising in unison. "We need to go," the man shouted. But I couldn't move. Its head cocked at an unnatural angle, and for a moment, it seemed to be studying me. Then it let out a sound, a low, guttural rumble that vibrated through the walls and into my chest. The whispers stopped. The man shoved me toward the stairs. "Run now!" The creature lunged. I stumbled, nearly falling as its claws raked the doorframe, splintering the metal like cheap wood. The sound of its screech, high and guttural, was enough to shatter my thoughts. "Run!" the man yelled again, dragging me up the stairs. Behind us, the creature clawed its way into the corridor, its movements erratic and jerking, like a puppet pulled by frayed strings. The walls groaned, and the flickering bulb above us shattered, plunging everything into darkness. Part 5. The Tragedy of Greylock. We stumbled into the dim light spilling from the station above, slamming the door behind us. The sound of the creature's claws against the stairwell echoed below, but it didn't follow. Not yet. The man grabbed a heavy wooden bench and shoved it against the door, though I doubted it would hold. "What was that?" I gasped, doubling over, my breath coming in ragged bursts. My hands trembled so badly I couldn't steady them against my knees. The man didn't answer right away. He leaned against the wall, wiping his face with a trembling hand. He looked older now, his face drawn tight with exhaustion and something else, guilt maybe. His eyes avoided mine. "You never should have opened it," he muttered. His voice was low and brittle, barely more than a whisper. "I didn't know," I snapped. "You could have told me." He cut me off with a sharp look. "Would you have believed me? People don't listen. They never listen. That's how this place wins." "Wins?" I stared at him, incredulous. "What does that even mean? What is this place?" For a long moment, he didn't respond. He just stood there, staring at the door as though expecting it to burst open any second. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, softer. "You think you found Greylock by accident, don't you?" He laughed bitterly. "No one finds Greylock. It finds them. You were running from something, weren't you?" I opened my mouth to argue, but the words wouldn't come. "Yeah," he said, nodding. "Me too." He sank onto the bench, his head in his hands. "I didn't come here by choice. I came because there was nowhere else to go." And now he trailed off, shaking his head. He didn't look at me as he spoke again, his voice distant, as if recounting something from a dream. "It was a long time ago," he began. "I grew up in a little mining town not far from here. Nothing special, just a dead-end place where everyone worked themselves to death for scraps. My parents were no different." His hands fidgeted in his lap, his fingers twisting an invisible thread. "Dad worked the mines. Mom did the books for the company. They weren't happy. Not really, but they were good people. Decent. They worked hard to keep the roof over our heads, even when things started going bad." "What happened?" I asked, unable to keep the question from spilling out. He sighed, his shoulders slumping. "The mines were old, unstable. Everyone knew it was just a matter of time before something gave way. They warned the company, But management didn't care. Profits mattered more than lives. He finally looked up at me, his eyes hollow. The collapse happened on a Friday. My dad was underground when it started. They said it was an explosion, methane buildup, but no one really knows for sure. All I know is he didn't come back up. I swallowed hard, but he wasn't done. Mom blamed herself. She said she should have seen it coming, should have stopped it. But what could she have done? She started drinking, and when that wasn't enough, his voice broke, and he rubbed a hand over his face. She didn't leave a note, just turned the oven on and locked the doors. The silence that followed felt suffocating. I was 15, he said finally, and alone. The faint sound of claws scraping the metal stairs drifted up from below, breaking the spell. That's when Greylock called me, he said, his voice heavy with resignation. It finds people like me, people who've got nothing left to lose. Part 6, Greylock's Lure. The man's words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. The scraping below had stopped, but the silence was worse, an anticipatory hush that made my skin crawl. How does a place call you? I asked, though my voice felt small, fragile. The man didn't answer right away. He stared at his hands, his fingers tracing invisible patterns on his knees. When he finally spoke, his tone was distant, as though he were addressing someone else entirely. You don't hear it. Not exactly, he said. It's more like an ache, a pull, like a thread wrapped around your ribs, tugging you in a direction you can't quite name. He looked up, meeting my gaze. You know what I mean, don't you? I opened my mouth to deny it, but the words caught in my throat. Because he was right. It had started weeks ago, a restless, gnawing feeling that no matter where I went, I wasn't where I was supposed to be. I'd driven for days, crossing state lines without any destination in mind, until I'd stumbled across Greylock in that forgotten travel guide. Even then, it wasn't the description that convinced me. It was the way the name lingered in my mind, a phantom whisper that wouldn't let go. I nodded, and his expression darkened. That's how it gets you, he said, his voice rough. That ache, that pull, and by the time you realize what's happening, it's too late. Too late for what? I demanded, my frustration bubbling over. What does this place want? He gestured toward the door. You already saw it, didn't you? That thing down there? That's not the first, and it won't be the last. It's part of this place, part of whatever's been festering here for God knows how long. And you opening that door, he trailed off, shaking his head. What? I pressed, stepping closer. What did I do? You invited it, he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. The weight of his words pressed down on me, and I staggered back, my breath hitching in my chest. No, I said, shaking my head. That's insane. This is just some old station, some abandoned. It's not abandoned, he snapped, cutting me off. Not really. People come here, just like us. They show up looking for answers, for escape, for something. But they don't leave. Why not? He gave me a hollow smile. Because Greylock doesn't let them. A loud bang echoed from below, shaking the walls. We both flinched, our heads snapping toward the door. The creature was still down there, waiting, its presence pressing against the air like a thunderstorm about to break. Listen to me, the man said, his tone urgent. If we're going to have any chance of getting out of here, we need to get to the top of the station. There's something up there, a beacon or a signal, or, I don't know, but it's our only shot. How do you know? I've seen it, he said, though his voice faltered. I almost made it once, but he hesitated, his expression flickering with something that looked like shame. But I didn't make it in time. The thing down there, he shook his head. It's stronger now, smarter. It's feeding off of us. Before I could respond, another bang sounded, louder this time. The door shuddered against its frame, and a deep, guttural growl reverberated through the air. The man grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the stairs leading up. We have to move, now. Reluctantly, I followed, my pulse thundering in my ears. Part 7, The Betrayal. The stairs creaked and groaned beneath us as we ascended, the air growing colder with each step. The walls, once lined with chipped paint and mildew, were now smooth and dark, almost like polished stone. It was as if the station itself was transforming around us, reshaping into something more sinister. The man moved quickly, his breathing shallow but steady. I struggled to keep up, my legs burning with every step. Below us, the door banged again, the creature's growl chasing us upward. How much farther? I gasped. Not far, he said, his voice tense. Just keep moving. The stairwell twisted again, spiraling upward into darkness. My foot slipped on something slick, blood, maybe, and I stumbled, catching myself against the wall. That's when I noticed it. The smell. Not the rancid stench of the creature below, but something else. Something faintly floral. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. It was familiar, achingly so. Lilacs. My mother's perfume. I turned to the man, my voice trembling. Do you smell that? He didn't stop, didn't even glance back. Ignore it. The station plays tricks. But it wasn't a trick. It couldn't be. The scent was too vivid, too real. And then, faintly, I heard it, a voice calling my name. Eli. I stopped cold, my blood turning to ice. It was my mother's voice. The man noticed I'd fallen behind and turned sharply. What are you doing? I stared at him, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I heard her. I heard my mom. She's here. His face darkened, his jaw tightening. No, she isn't. That's what it wants you to think. But I couldn't move. The sound of her voice was stronger now, echoing from somewhere down the stairwell we'd just climbed. Eerie, come back. Please. You have to keep going, the man barked, grabbing my arm and pulling me forward. Wait. I wrenched free, my mind spinning. How do you know? How do you know it's not real? His expression faltered, guilt flashing across his face. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, the walls around us shuddered violently. The station growled, and then I saw it, a flash of movement in the corner of my eye. Not the creature below, but something or someone higher up the stairs. A figure, hunched and shadowed, holding something. I squinted, trying to make sense of the image, but before I could, the man lunged at me. What are you? His hands gripped my shoulders with surprising strength, shoving me backward. My foot slipped, and I fell hard against the stairs, the impact knocking the breath from my lungs. He loomed over me, his face contorted with desperation. I'm sorry, he muttered. It's the only way. I can't do this again. Do what? I screamed, clawing at his hands. You're the one it wants, he said, his voice breaking. I just need a little more time, just enough to make it to the top. I stared at him in disbelief as realization dawned. He wasn't trying to help me. He was using me. The station trembled again, the growl rising into a deafening roar. The stairs below me cracked and buckled, and I felt the pull of gravity as the world tilted. The man released me, scrambling upward as the floor beneath me gave way. I reached out, grasping for something, anything to hold on to. My fingers found the edge of a broken stair, and I clung to it desperately, my body dangling over the dark abyss below. Above me, the man was already disappearing into the shadows, his footsteps fading. I'm sorry, he called back, his voice barely audible over the chaos. You'll understand. Someday. And then he was gone. Part 8. Into the abyss. I dangled over the edge, my fingers gripping the jagged stair with a desperation I hadn't known I possessed. The pit below me wasn't just darkness. It felt alive, humming with a strange energy that clawed at my skin and pulled at my thoughts. Above, the man's footsteps faded completely, swallowed by the twisting shadows. He was gone, and I was alone. The station shifted again, a groan reverberating through the walls like the exhale of a dying beast. The jagged edge I clung to splintered further, and I screamed as my grip faltered. Help! My voice was hoarse, swallowed by the vast emptiness below. For a moment, I thought I heard a reply, a faint echo, distant and mocking. And then the stair gave way entirely. I fell. The air rushed past me, cold and sharp, and the world became a blur of darkness and sound. My stomach twisted as I tumbled, my body helpless against the pull of whatever waited below. When I hit the ground, it wasn't solid. The impact knocked the wind from my lungs, and I lay there gasping, disoriented. The surface beneath me was soft, pliable, but it writhed under my weight, shifting and pulsing like it was alive. I forced myself to sit up, my head spinning. The darkness around me wasn't absolute. Faint, sickly light seeped from the walls, revealing glimpses of my surroundings. The ground wasn't ground at all. It was flesh. I gagged, scrambling backward as I realized what I was sitting on. The surface was mottled and slick, veins pulsing beneath a translucent membrane. It stretched endlessly in all directions, rising and falling like the chest of a sleeping giant. But it wasn't sleeping. The whispers began again, faint at first, then growing louder. They came from everywhere and nowhere, overlapping and incoherent, like 1,000 voices speaking at once. My ears throbbed as the sound grew unbearable, and I pressed my hands over them, desperate to block it out. That's when I saw them. Figures, dozens of them, scattered across the fleshy landscape, their forms twisted and grotesque. Some were fused to the ground, their limbs stretched unnaturally, their mouths locked in silent screams. Others wandered aimlessly, their bodies contorted as if they were trying to escape their own skin. And then I realized something even worse. I recognized them, not their faces, but the way they moved. The man from the stairwell, a woman I'd passed on the bus to Greylock, a boy who had stared out the window at nothing, his eyes hollow. All the people who had been called here. A shadow loomed ahead, larger than the others, and my heart seized as I realized it was moving toward me. Its form was indistinct, shifting with each step, but its presence was undeniable. It radiated malice, a suffocating weight that pressed against my chest and stole the air from my lungs. I stumbled to my feet, my legs trembling. "Stay back!" It didn't stop. The whispers swelled, converging into a single voice, deep and guttural, like the rumble of an earthquake. "You opened the door." I shook my head, backing away. "It wasn't me. I didn't know." "You opened the door." The voice reverberated through my skull, drowning out my thoughts. The shadow reached for me, its limbs unfurling like smoke, and I turned to run. But there was nowhere to go. Part 9, The Entity's Truth. I ran blindly, the grotesque, pulsing ground squelching underfoot, but every direction felt the same, endless, suffocating alive. The whispers surrounded me, growing louder and sharper, until they felt like nails scraping the inside of my skull. Ahead, the darkness deepened, a towering void rising out of the fleshy expanse. It wasn't a wall. It moved, its form shifting and rippling like oil on water. The shadow. I skidded to a stop, my breath catching in my throat. The whispers fell silent, replaced by a low, resonant hum that vibrated through my body. And then it spoke again. "You opened the door." The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, each word like the toll of a funeral bell. "I didn't mean to," I stammered, backing away. "I didn't know." "You knew." It interrupted, its tone almost pitying. "You came here because you wanted to know, because you were called." "I didn't." "Do not lie to me." The ground beneath my feet buckled, and I fell to my knees. My hands sank into the flesh, and I yanked them back, ball rising in my throat. The shadow shifted, condensing into something more solid. A figure began to emerge, impossibly tall and thin, its limbs bending at unnatural angles. Its face, if it could be called that, was smooth and featureless, save for 2 hollow pits where eyes should have been. "You seek answers," it said, stepping closer. "But you already know the truth." "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "I don't." The figure stopped, towering over me. "Then let me show you." Before I could protest, its hand, or what passed for a hand, reached out, brushing my forehead. And suddenly, I wasn't in Greylock anymore. I was standing in my childhood home. The living room was exactly as I remembered it. Worn furniture, muted sunlight filtering through the curtains, the faint smell of coffee and lavender. But it was wrong. The room was too quiet, too still. Dust hung in the air, frozen in place, and the light had a strange, lifeless quality, as though it had been painted on. And then I saw them. My parents, they were sitting on the couch, their bodies slack, their faces blank. Their eyes, glassy and unblinking, stared straight ahead, seeing nothing. "Mom," I said, my voice trembling. "Dad." They didn't respond. The figure appeared beside me, its presence cold and oppressive. "This is your truth," it said. "No," I whispered, stepping toward them. "They're dead. I buried them." "Did you?" the figure asked, its voice a mocking lilt. The scene shifted, the living room dissolving into ash. Now I was standing in a hospital room. Machines beeped softly in the corner, their lights casting a faint glow over the sterile walls. My father lay in the bed, his face pale and gaunt, his chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. My mother sat beside him, holding his hand, tears streaming down her face. "You left them," the figure said. "I didn't," I snapped, but my voice faltered. I couldn't stay. I had to." "You ran." The words hit me like a punch to the gut, and I stumbled back. "You've been running ever since," it continued, its tone sharp and unforgiving. "From the guilt, from the pain, from them." "No," I screamed, clutching my head. "That's not true." But deep down I knew it was. The hospital room shattered like glass, and I was back in the station's grotesque depths, the shadow looming over me. "That is why you were called here," it said. "Greylock feeds on the broken, on those who cannot face themselves." I stared at it, my chest heaving. "What do you want from me?" The figure's hollow eyes burned into mine. "The same thing I want from all who come here." It leaned closer, its voice a whisper that cut through my soul. "Everything." Part 10. Bargain with the Abyss. "Everything," it said again, and the word echoed in my head like a gavel, striking. My breath hitched. "I don't understand." "You will," it replied, and with a slow, deliberate motion, it reached toward me again. I flinched, expecting the same cold touch, the same flood of memories. But this time, the ground beneath me writhed, and I was dragged backward, sinking into the pulsing, fleshy mass. My screams caught in my throat as the substance engulfed me, pulling me into the depths of Greylock. I clawed at the air, my hands finding nothing solid. The whispers returned, louder now, like a rising tide of voices. They didn't overlap anymore. They were in harmony, a chant. "You will give, you will give, you will give." The words pounded in my skull as I sank deeper into the suffocating blackness. And then suddenly I wasn't falling anymore. I landed with a jolt. My body sprawled across cold, hard stone. I gasped for air, my chest burning, and when I looked up, I was in a cavern. The walls stretched endlessly, glittering with veins of something that glowed faintly, casting eerie shadows across the space. The ground beneath me was rough and uneven, and at the center of the cavern stood a massive, jagged obelisk. It pulsed faintly, the same rhythm as the whispers. A figure stood beside it. It was the man. He looked different now, older, more gaunt. His clothes were torn, and his eyes had the hollow, glassy sheen of someone who had stared into the abyss for far too long. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low and cracked. My words caught in my throat. "You pushed me. You left me to die." His gaze fell, shame flickering across his face. I had no choice. No choice. I staggered to my feet, fury bubbling up in my chest. "You used me as bait." "I had to," he snapped, his voice breaking. "Do you think I want to be here? Do you think I chose this? Then why?" He gestured to the obelisk, his hands trembling. "Because it doesn't let you leave. Not unless you give it what it wants." "And what does it want?" His eyes met mine, and they were filled with a despair so deep it made my stomach turn. "It wants a sacrifice," he said. "It feeds on us, on our pain, our fear, our guilt. But it's not enough. To leave, you have to give it someone else. Someone broken, someone like you." The cavern trembled, the obelisk pulsing brighter, and the whispers swelled into a crescendo. "You brought me here," I whispered, the realization hitting me like a blow. "You knew this would happen. You needed me to take your place." Tears welled in his eyes, but he didn't deny it. "I didn't want to. I thought maybe this time it would be different. but it's always the same. You're a coward. I spat, my voice trembling with rage. You let it win. And you won't? He asked, his tone bitter. You think you're stronger? That you can face it and walk away? The whispers grew louder, the cavern shaking violently. I'm not like you, I said, stepping toward him. I'm not giving up. Not to this place. Not to you. He laughed hollowly, backing away. You'll see. It breaks everyone eventually. The obelisk pulsed again, and the ground between us cracked open, revealing a gaping chasm. From the darkness below, a shape began to emerge, twisting, writhing, impossible. The whisper stopped, and the thing spoke. Choose, it said, its voice reverberating through the cavern. The man turned to me, desperation etched across his face. Please, he begged, don't do this. You don't understand. But I did understand. I stared at him, then at the obelisk, and finally at the thing rising from the chasm. It wanted a sacrifice, and I wasn't ready to die. Part 11. The Rising Shadow. The cavern groaned, the fissure widening as the shadow writhed upward, stretching its form into something vaguely human, but only just. Limbs splintered and reformed, each movement accompanied by a sickening crackle, as though it were piecing itself together from broken fragments. Choose, it repeated, the word like a blade dragging across my mind. The man stumbled backward, his face pale and drawn. Please, he whispered, his voice trembling. I didn't mean for it to go this far. You can stop this. You can. The shadow twisted violently, cutting him off. Its eyeless gaze bore into me, though I felt it searching deeper, sifting through my thoughts, my fears. Somewhere in the distance, a faint sound broke through the cavern's oppressive hum. A shuffle of footsteps. I turned, and there he was, the homeless man. He stood near the cavern's edge, his figure barely visible in the dim light. His clothes hung in tatters, his face obscured by a scraggly beard and layers of grime. His eyes, though bloodshot and wild, gleamed with a strange intelligence. He muttered to himself, words spilling out in a stream of garbled nonsense. I couldn't understand him, but his tone rose and fell with urgency, as though he were delivering a prophecy only he could comprehend. The man by the obelisk seemed oblivious to him, his focus entirely on me. It's stronger now, he said, his voice rising in panic. It's feeding off you. You have to make a choice. The whispers returned, faint but insistent, as if the cavern itself were joining the chorus. My chest tightened, and I felt the weight of their command. Choose, choose, choose. I looked back at the shadow, its form shifting endlessly, its presence of physical weight pressing down on me. The fissure beneath it seethed, a roiling mass of something alive, something hungry. The homeless man's voice rose, his nonsensical words spilling over into a frantic chant. He pointed at the obelisk, then at the shadow, his gestures erratic but deliberate. What is he saying? I demanded, my voice cracking. The man by the obelisk didn't look at him. It doesn't matter. He's just another piece of this place. Like me. Like you. But it did matter. The homeless man's eyes locked onto mine, and for a fleeting moment, his gibberish seemed to crystallize into something clear. Don't feed it. Don't let it win. The shadow jerked, its movement sharper now, angrier. The fissure widened, its edges crumbling away, and the obelisk pulsed violently, its glow spilling across the cavern like blood. Choose, the shadow roared, its voice reverberating through my skull. The man by the obelisk fell to his knees, his hands clasped in a desperate prayer. Please, he begged, his voice cracking. It's the only way. Give it what it wants, and we can leave. We can be free. But the homeless man stepped closer, his bony finger jabbing toward the shadow. His muttering grew louder, defiant, and though I couldn't understand him, his presence felt like an anchor in the storm. The shadow recoiled slightly, its form flickering, but the fissure surged upward, tendrils of darkness lashing toward me. My choice was no longer just between the shadow and the man. It was whether I believed escape was possible at all. Part 12. What lies beyond? The cavern quaked, the shadow expanding and contracting like a massive, beating heart. Its tendrils reached closer, brushing the edges of my consciousness, whispering promises of freedom, of peace, of escape. The man by the obelisk groaned, clawing at the stone as though it could save him. "Give it to me," he screamed, his voice desperate. "Let it take you. It's the only way." But the homeless man moved between us, his fragile body a defiant barrier. His chants rose above the chaos, nonsensical but relentless, a rhythm that seemed to shake the shadow itself. His wild eyes burned with an intensity that made the fissures glow dim by comparison. The shadow hesitated, its form rippling, as if uncertain. "Stop!" I shouted, my voice cracking under the weight of the moment. I'll choose." The homeless man froze, his muttering faltering, but his gaze never left mine. His lips moved silently, as though begging me to reconsider. The shadow's tendrils withdrew slightly, curling in anticipation. I stepped forward. The whispers surged in my ears, a cacophony of voices overlapping, urging me to surrender. I stared at the obelisk, the pulsing glow reflecting in my eyes, and reached out, my fingers brushing its jagged surface. The cavern fell silent. For a moment, there was nothing but stillness. Then the obelisk began to crack, fractures spreading across its surface like veins. The fissure beneath it roared, and the shadow let out a guttural howl, its form writhing in agony. The man by the obelisk screamed, clawing at his face. "What have you done?" "I didn't choose you," I said, my voice steady. The homeless man's face split into a grin, his wild eyes gleaming. "Good," he said, his voice clear and sharp for the first time. "Now we see." The obelisk shattered, and the fissure erupted, spewing light so bright it blinded me. I stumbled back, shielding my eyes, as the shadow was dragged into the torrent, its howls echoing through the cavern. Then the light consumed everything. I awoke on the ground, the air cool and fresh against my skin. Blinking, I sat up and looked around. I wasn't in the cavern anymore. I was outside, standing on the platform of Greylock Station. The sky above was a pale, washed-out gray, and the faint hum of distant power lines filled the air. The homeless man sat on a bench nearby, humming softly to himself. He looked calmer now, his ragged features smoothed out by a strange serenity. "What would happen?" I asked, my voice hoarse. He didn't answer directly. Instead, he pointed to the edge of the platform. I followed his gaze. The man from the obelisk was there, standing just beyond the tracks. His back was to me, his body stiff and motionless. Something about the way he stood made my stomach twist. I stepped closer, my heart pounding. "Hey," I called out. "Are you?" He turned, and I froze. It wasn't his face anymore. It was mine. Every detail, every line, every scar, a perfect replica, staring back at me with hollow eyes. "You gave it your choice," the homeless man said behind me. "And it chose you." I spun around, but he was gone. When I looked back, the man knew the thing was gone too. I was alone, the faint scent of lilacs lingering in the air.
Subscribe and like this video.